Father, we wanted to touch on an article that came our way via LifeSite News about Francis, talking about the quote-unquote non-acceptance of Vatican II, and he says that this is the problem in the church today. Francis talks about this restorationism idea. He says that these people have come to, quote, gag the council, the Second Vatican Council. He criticizes the old-fashioned methods of these people. He says that the council that most pastors remember best is the Council of Trent, and he complains about this, saying that they instead should remember...
Council of Trent taking place in the 1500s, but most people remember that mess.
Yes.
Well, that's kind of an admission, I would say. Right?
Yeah. But he I thought it was interesting, Father. He singles out...
They remember it as Catholic, let's put it that way.
Oh, yeah. But he singles out the United States in particular and says that there's so many restorers in the United States. He says the number there is significant, and again complains about this. I mean, he pretty much says it plainly. We would agree with him that this is the issue facing the church today, Vatican II or not. And he admits that this is the issue.
This is the issue, right? Yeah. This is the issue that is somehow afflicting the church.
Above everything else.
Wow.
Everything else. This is it.
It's all about Vatican II, right?
Yes.
It's the conflict between Vatican II and the traditional faith. Okay, well, I don't always agree with him, but I would have to say I agree. That is the great conflict, right?
Yes.
You know what it reminds me of?
What's that?
Those who say, forget the old normal, there's no going back, right? You've got to get used to the new normal because there's no going back to the old normal. That's gone forever, right? Francis basically has the same message. Francis actually reminds me of somebody, and that is he reminds me of Klaus Schwab. Klaus Schwab has set himself up as like the pontiff of the New World Order, right? And Francis is the pontiff of modernism, the new religious world order, as it were. And they have the same message. They just, use basically different terminology for it, but it comes down to the same thing. I do have this article here, Tom, and this article comes to us from LifeSite News, and it's interesting. In fact, I was kind of surprised the article wasn't more prominent. But maybe they decided to bury it because they think it's nonsense, which it is. But the problem is that there are hundreds of millions of people who considered Francis to be the supreme pontiff and the vicar of Christ on earth of the true Roman Catholic Church, where he's actually the supreme pontiff of the new order. But this is what the article in LifeSite News says. It's headlined, Pope Francis claims non-acceptance of Vatican II is the Church's current problem. Argentine pontiff decried those in the church he called restorers for their desire to remember the Council of Trent. If that's accurate, he wants the Council of Trent forgotten. Remember when the Novus Ordo first came out and Cardinal Ottaviani wrote his intervention? Remember that? Yeah, this was back in 1969. Cardinal the Ottaviani intervention. Right? He was talking about the New Order Mass. He said there that the New Order of Mass has no intention of standing for the faith as taught by the Council of Trent, to which the Catholic conscience is bound forever. That was 1969. And here Francis, after all this time, is bringing up again what he would think, the ghost or the specter of Trent, and saying we have to leave that behind. Exactly what Cardinal Ottaviani was warning against the new rite of Mass that Paul VI produced. So this is actually a damning admission by Francis, almost as though he's getting desperate. And they're having these show trials for the insurrection going on in Washington, D.C., because, they have to break down all the resistance to the democratic program. And Francis, on his part now in the Vatican, is cranking up the heat on the traditional restorers. LifeSite News. Pope Francis has attacked traditionalists in the church, saying that the current problem in the church is precisely the non-acceptance of the Second Vatican Council. In a wide-ranging interview with Jesuit magazines held in May 19th, but published June 14th, Pope Francis spoke on the role of the Jesuit order in the church today and the Russia-Ukraine war, but chiefly attacked Restorationism, which he said had come to gag the council. Well, actually, the council has been gagging ever since 1962, 63, 64, and 65, right? It's been gagging and trying to strangle the true church. He says, referring to the Second Vatican Council as the point from which to base evangelization efforts, Francis said that it is very difficult to see spiritual renewal using old-fashioned criteria. Well, those old-fashioned criteria produced magnificent missionary efforts, including the Jesuits prominently. Not the fake Jesuits that he's addressing here, not the fake Jesuit that he is, but the real Jesuits who were genuine missionaries of a real traditional Catholic Church and her teaching, according to old-fashioned criteria, what he says now we have to reject. So the very methods of St. Ignatius Loyola, in the very process of rejecting them, he's saying that this is the new mission of the Jesuits, the new Jesuits, right? Who are the enemies of the old Jesuits, the enemies of St. Ignatius Loyola and St. Francis Xavier. He says, restoration has come to gag the council. He said this before addressing the American church in particular. The number of groups of restorers, for example, in the United States, there are many, is significant. Words of Francis, right? Thank you, Francis, for the compliment. He said, the article goes on to say, Pope Francis criticized the ideas, behaviors, which came from the groups of restorers, advising the assembled Jesuits that the council must be more heavily promoted in order to be accepted. After all this time, the council must be more heavily promoted? How can it be more heavily promoted than what they went through, than what they've done? They're bludgeoning people to accept it, right? Having an entire generation or two grow up with the council and the aftermath of the council, and they still can't sell it. That tells you something. By the way, when he uses the word restorers, I hear Hillary Clinton condemning the deplorables. It's almost like these are the deplorables in the church, in Francis's mind. And this is a quote from him. There are ideas, behaviors that arise from a restorationism that basically did not accept the council. The problem is precisely this. In some contexts, the council has not yet been accepted. It is also true that it takes a century for a council to take root. We still have 40 years to make it take root then. Well, that's interesting. Remember when the devil was heard by Pope Leo XIII and was told, I give you 100 years? He said, how much time do you need? 100 years, he said. I give you your 100 years, right? Is that when the 100 years began? To see if he could get the council to take root? Is that the 100 years Francis is talking about? This is the last great push to make sure everybody accepts the council? I don't know. Curious, though. At the close of his meeting, Francis had this meeting with the Jesuit magazine editors in May. It was published in June 14th. Pope Francis repeated his open attack on traditionalists, saying, sorry if I went on too long. He's obsessing about this, actually. But I wanted to underline the post-council and Arupe issues because the current problem of the church is precisely the non-acceptance of the council. He keeps going back to that, as though, as I say, he's obsessed with it. The Pope's newly released interview comes days after he criticized the Sicilian bishops for their use of grandma's lace in the liturgy. He criticized them for using lace in the liturgy. Now, you know, I am not very fond of lace. I'm even considered the destroyer of lace because when I have lace on an alb, I generally, on the way up the steps to the altar, tend to do some damage to it, okay? I'm not against it in principle, but here Francis is mocking the use of lace as though it's somehow paying tribute to grandma rather than paying tribute to Holy Mother Church. Who ever thought of that? But Francis. It wouldn't occur to anybody but Francis that by wearing the lace on my surplice or my alb, I'm paying tribute to grandma because I'm wearing grandma's lace. This is absurd, but this is the way the man thinks. It's very childish. There was even a deacon in Great Britain who criticized Francis's criticism and says that actually traditional Catholics are just trying to uphold the traditional teaching and traditional practice of the Church. Exactly the opposite of what Pope Francis, so-called, is doing. He says Francis really needs to look in the mirror, he says, quote unquote, look in the mirror and check himself and find what he is guilty of. And a liturgical scholar they quote in the article in LifeSite News, a man named Matthew Hazel, expressed concerns over Francis's interview, writing, quote, Vatican II will be made to take root no matter how much pastoral damage it causes. Well, I think these gentlemen who realize what's going on here need to actually take a stand firmly for the traditional faith exclusively and stop trying to reconcile the Novus Ordo, the New Order of Vatican II, with the traditional Catholic faith, and realize that these are intrinsically opposed to each other. The one is modernism, the complexus of all heresies, the synthesis of all heresies, and the other is the traditional Catholic faith. And there can be no peace between them. One is designed to destroy the other. And yet they remain within carrying on, unfortunately, trying to pretend that you can practice the traditional Catholic faith honestly and in its integrity within the context of the Novus Ordo, and you can't. In any case, the article goes on to talk about the German synodal way, which is certainly schismatic. Even against the Novus Ordo, it's schismatic. And Francis's comment there was, again, very telling. He was talking about this German synodal way, which wants to take its own route. I mean, Francis was the one who started this whole talk about the synodal path. And the Germans are just taking it to its logical conclusion. But Francis says, he speaks against the Germans taking it to this other path. He says, why? Because it's wrong? Because he condemns it? No. His answer, in Germany, there is a very good evangelical church already. We don't need two of them. As though to say, well, the German synodal way is going to become another evangelical church. He said, well, why do we need two? We have perfectly good evangelical church already, Protestant church already. So, and he, of course, is perfectly at peace with that. He embraces that. He can celebrate with these people. And so again, I mean, everything he says is so revealing about his faithlessness. The man does not have faith at all, any faith. So there's more that could be said about this. I do encourage you to go to the LifeSite News website and look and see this article, read it, and you'll find it very revealing. That Francis, they say, is planning to retire, although Maradiaga, what's his name? One of his advisors says that's not true. He's not planning that at all, but you can't believe a word that they say. That's the problem. But it was just brought to my attention recently that Francis has not only made 21 new cardinals for the modernist church of Vatican II, all 21 of them being radical and LGBTQ sympathizers, all 21 of them. But that brings the total of Francis's cardinal electors, that is, cardinals who can actually vote for a new supreme pontiff of the new order, to 63%. 63% of the modernist cardinals of the New Order Church were named by Francis. 29% were named by Benedict. And 8% of the remaining elector, that is, cardinals who can actually vote, were put in place by John Paul II. Now you might say 63%, that's a pretty serious majority, just named by Francis, as he's trying to stack the College of Cardinals of the new church in order to basically predetermine who his successors will be as the Supreme Pontiff of the Novus Ordo, of the New Order. And one might say, oh, gee, if only we had more of those established by Benedict and more of those put in place by John Paul II. But wait a minute. It was the ones who were put in place by Benedict and the ones who were put in place by John Paul who elected Francis in the first place. They're the ones who gave us Francis. The 63% appointed by Francis all were appointed because the others appointed by Benedict and John Paul, elected Francis in the first place and put him in the position to name that 63%. So let's not have any of this, if only Benedict, if only John Paul II. They're the ones who gave you Francis in the first place. So let's face reality here, not try to sugarcoat it at all. There are a lot of New Order Catholics. They're New Order Catholics because that's the religion they're practicing. They're going to the New Order liturgy, and they're going along with all of these New Order prescriptions and looking to Novus Ordo bishops, modernist bishops, to tell them what they should do to be Catholic. And yet so many of them still have the true faith. We know that they have. Many of them have the true faith. Many of them kind of wash up on our shores of the traditional Catholic churches and chapels, and they find their solid land, and they find the faith that they believe in. They know that what they believe is at variance with what's actually being preached to them from the pulpit, what's being preached to them from the Vatican, that it offends what they believe, because they still do believe the true faith. And they find their way back more and more and more and more to the true Mass, the true sacraments, the true faith, practice the true faith. That's how we know so many of these good people actually do still have the true faith after years and years and years of living basically in the gulag of the Novus Ordo. Even young people, somehow they imbibe that they just know instinctively what the true faith is. It's a grace from God. They come and they embrace the traditional faith. Faith they were perhaps never fully trained in. Maybe they had conservative parents, but not always. Maybe they had conservative parents who were Novus Ordo, but it still taught them the traditional catechism. But not always. There are young people who grew up with very radical Novus Ordo, liberal modernist parents who still find their way to the traditional faith. It's the grace of God. It has to be a miracle of grace, but they do find their way there. And so, God bless them and guide them and bring them back to the practice, bring them to the practice of the true faith in its integrity. The problem is some of them will find a halfway house, which is quasi-traditional, traditional enough, Novus Ordo enough to make them feel comfortable that they have a foot in both camps. They're going to experience the contradiction, the internal inevitable contradiction between Catholicism and modernism. They're going to have to get off that non-existent fence. It exists only in their own minds. And I pray that they get off, as it were, on the side of traditional Catholicism and practice the faith in its integrity. Mm-hmm. So in any case, we pray for that.
Yes. Father, just real quickly, where do you see things going in the Novus Ordo Church? You mentioned